Well, a very warm welcome, everybody, and thanks for joining us today for our next Shoesmiths employment webinar, where we're going to be focusing on data subject access requests and some related topics aimed at employers. My name's Adele Hayfield. I'm a partner in the employment team based in the Birmingham office, and I'm pleased to be joined today and co-presenting alongside two of my colleagues, Michael and Gwynneth, who are also partners in the employment team. And we're also pleased to have with us today Antonia Blackwell, our professional support lawyer, who's going to be keeping us in check, we hope, Antonia, and fielding some of the questions alongside us. A few housekeeping points before we get cracking with today's session. And I know many of you will have been to one of our national webinars already, and also you may have read the slides that were just displayed on screen. But a couple of key points to bear in mind. So everybody is muted, please just bear that in mind. And also please feel free to use the Q&A panel during today's session. So the session's due to last for approximately an hour and 15 minutes. And what we've done is we've left a bit of space at the end of the session so that we can have a bit of a wrap up with any Q&As. The plan is to also stop partway through the session and take some questions then as well. And also, please look out for a poll. So I'll be running a poll after my section, the first section, asking a few simple questions. So don't worry, we're not going to test you, just to gather some information. And we're going to share that information with you at the end of today's session. Finally, I just wanted to mention that at the end of the session, we are going to ask you to fill in some feedback surveys. And it's just really a big plea from us. At the moment, we're in the planning stages in terms of what we're going to cover with our national webinar series for the rest of this year. So it will be hugely helpful if you are able to give some feedback. I know you've all got busy days, but just a couple of seconds on that would be fantastic. I think that is the main housekeeping item. So if we have a look at the overview for today's session then. So as I said earlier, we're going to focus on data subject access requests today and then some interrelated issues. And I should say that the four of us, in fact, we all sit in a special subunit of the employment team. And we focus on data protection issues specifically for employers. And we come across the sorts of issues that we're going to be talking about today on a very regular basis. And I think my panel will agree with me that they're often embroiled in really thorny employment disputes. So that's how they usually come to bear. Today, as I say, we're going to start with some standalone topics. And you'll see those listed on the slide. Firstly, the implications for UK data protection law in relation to the transition period coming to an end and the B word, Brexit. And then we're going to look at a few statistics, just they'll be of interest to you, I believe, in cases where organisations have been penalised for failing to comply with data protection law compliance. Before we get into the main topic of the day, which is focusing on data subject access requests, and we'll give you some practical guidance in terms of how organisations should be handling those when they receive them from employees. We're going to look at the really vital guidance that came through from the ICO and only very briefly touch on data breaches at the end, and Gwynneth's going to do that at the end of the session. Okay, thank you. So first of all then, it would be remiss of us not to mention the position post-Brexit in terms of data protection law. And I'm sure most of you will be, all too familiar with the key pieces of data protection legislation that have been applicable until the 31st of December here in the UK prior to the transition period coming to an end. Let's face it, it would be frankly impossible for anyone to have escaped the introduction of the GDPR back in May 2018 when that came in. And then obviously we had the updated DPA, Data Protection Act, as well. Since the 31st of December 2020, there's been a few changes to that. but not so much practical in terms of the rules that you have to apply, which is obviously good news for employers. So the transition period obviously came to an end, and what that meant was, from a legal perspective, the European GDPR as was is no longer directly applicable to the UK. But as it says there on the slide, the UK has retained the GDPR in its own domestic law, so in UK law, and we now call this the UK GDPR. Well, that's easy to remember, isn't it? So that sits alongside the DPA, the Data Protection Act 2018, that continues to apply. So that's a really key point. I suppose the practical thing coming off that is you may need to have a look at some of your policies or notices to see whether you're referring to the old law and perhaps bring those up to date. So that's just a practical point relating to that. And since the 31st of December 2020, obviously there have been further changes in relation to data protection law here in the UK, and these relate to basically the position as regards the flow of data cross-border between countries that sit in what we call the EEA and the UK. So this is the other key point that I've mentioned on the slide there. And the situation in relation to this is, if we look at it from the perspective of data that moves from the EEA to the UK, well, from January, the UK became what we call a third country, which means that unless we are deemed adequate permanently by the EU, then certain safeguards may have to be used in the future. Now, I stress the word may because at the moment, as it says on the slide, we've got a bit of a grace period. A grace period of 4 months that might be extended up to 6 months, within which the European Commission are debating as to whether the UK will be deemed adequate as a third country to enable the free flow of data to the UK. And we expect a decision within that grace period. And I appreciate that all sounds a bit complex, and you might be sat there thinking, Adele, why are you telling us about this? We've come on a webinar to look at data subject access requests, but I think it's really critical for those big organisations that are global and that may have entities in the EEA that currently pass data into the UK. So it's definitely just one to have in the back of your mind. The final point on this slide is that from a UK perspective, organisations can currently continue to transfer data to the EEA. So this is the other way around, where the UK entity is sending it out into the EEA. This isn't restricted because basically the UK have said, well, we deem the EEA adequate. So that is fine to obviously transfer data in that basis. So really, just to summarise on this slide, I appreciate that's fairly technical what we've gone through, but the takeaway points from the slide are that the name of the law has changed. It's the UK GDPR, but the substance has not. Really, the changes just were to make it relevant for a UK context-based law. The same key principles, rights and obligations that you've known for the last couple of years still apply. You may need to make some tweaks to the names of laws in your policies. Thank you, Claire. Okay, I told you I was going to jump around with topics at the start today. So we're on to something completely different, which is just to give you a little bit of an overview as to complaints that the ICO, our regulatory body here in the UK, receive. So as you'll see on the graphs there, and I won't go through all of the data, 2 key points really jump out at me. The first is in relation to the sheer number of complaints that the ICO is dealing with each year. And what you'll see from that first graph is it's roughly around the 40,000 mark. So that's a heck of a lot of complaints. But I think the more interesting point, given the context of today's session, is that stark figure in graph 2 that 46%, so almost half of those complaints received on an annual basis by the ICO relate to the right to subject access. So what that says to me is that there are a lot of data subjects, and you'll appreciate these will be consumers as well as employees, but we're focusing on employees today. A lot of people are complaining about organisations getting it wrong. And just purely from an employment perspective, I'm sure Gwynneth and Michael will agree with me that in the connected world that we are living in, employees are becoming so much more savvy around their rights and certainly are more inclined to submit subject access requests than ever before. Thanks, Claire. Okay, jumping on to the scary bit, if you like, and I think we always like to include something in our presentations about enforcement and what the powers of the ICO are, because it really brings home the message as to why data protection compliance is of utmost importance for all organisations. And, you know, absolutely in the employment sphere as well, because quite frankly, organisations do process so much employment data during sort of the employment life cycle. So when it comes then to enforcement by the ICO, they have a range of powers, as I'm sure you're aware, and they really go from things like issuing warnings or reprimands, all the way up to issuing monetary penalties for failing to comply with the law. And just briefly, the financial penalties are under the UK GDPR are based on a two-tier system. So you have the higher tier, which are for your most serious, thorny data protection breaches, and then you have a standard fine for those that are a bit more administrative in nature. And in terms of the higher maximum, as we call it, that's the terminology we refer to, the higher is, wait for it, £17.5 million or 4% of total annual worldwide turnover in the last preceding financial year. And it's whichever is the greater of those two figures, not the lesser. The standard is half that amount. So that really is the scary bit, but the reality is that that is the absolute far end of the scale. And, you know, it will be relatively rare, we hope, that organisations face those sorts of fines. But what we are seeing trundle through now are some eye-watering fines. And if I just point you to the bottom part of the slide, first of all, and what you'll see there are three big name organisations, some big brands there that have been fined very staggering amounts over the last couple of years. And in fact, just picking up on the BA case, my understanding is that that was going to be a lot more substantial in nature, but because of the pandemic, the impact of COVID on BA and other organisations in that sector, that fine has been mitigated down to 20 million. I mean, still a heck of a fine. The two cases on the top of the slide were just to give you some live examples of compliance breaches in relation to data subject access request matters, just for reference as much as anything. The BA, Marriott and Ticketmaster cases weren't on the subject of DSARs. So really, as I said a moment ago, the takeaway from this is it's critical that organisations get this right. Thank you. Okay, on to the main topic for today's session. And I've got quite a bit to say on this first slide because I always think it's important to set the scene. And we'll start with some of the basics. So most of you be aware, but when we talk about the right to access personal information, we're referring to data subjects who in our context would be your employees, your workforce, having the right to obtain information from their employer, the data controller, as to whether or not personal data about them is being processed, i.e. being used in any way. And if personal data is being processed by the employer, then the employees have the right to be given a copy of that personal data along with certain other information, which we're going to come to later in today's session. And it's fair to say, and I'm sure most of you dialing into today's call will have had experience of these, it's fair to say it is, the polite way is to call it frustrating to receive a data subject access request. And that's for a number of reasons. First and foremost, they are hugely time consuming to deal with. It creates additional work for often very busy HR, IT, privacy departments. And, they may be faced with having to deal with potentially thousands of documents, which will need to be analysed, redacted, reproduced for the data subject in line with the timescales that we're going to talk about in a moment. A couple of questions that came in from delegates on this before we move on. First is in relation to whose responsibility is it in terms of dealing with these requests? And this will depend on the type of organisation you are. Quite often, my view is that it is an important combined effort, a combined effort of HR, IT, and your data protection team internally, if indeed you have one. You may have a DPO, you may not. But my thoughts are that you may well have a nominated person that will head up the process. However, it absolutely requires combined effort on behalf of all of those. So I hope that answers the question that came in. Equally, I've had a second question that's popped up in terms of, well, what's the standard required of organisations? And the rules around this talk about the fact that a reasonable and proportionate search needs to be conducted. And that is right. It's not the case that there should be no stone unturned. It's got to be proportionate. But in my experience, that's still quite a high standard. I'm sure my colleagues will agree with me. So time consuming, yes. Costly, yes, of course it can be costly. But not only that, purely with my employment hat on, it can often come with a lot of emotion from the employees, or indeed emotion with the managers that are dealing with it. And that is particularly the case in an employment context, because employees rarely make access requests when the employment relationship's going well. I mean, that's the be all and end all of it. Often it's not going well. They're hand in hand with either threatened legal action or internal dispute, or actually legal action has been brought and it's a former colleague. Okay. And we often see disgruntled employees or ex-employees will bring DSARs to effectively gather evidence and do a bit of a fishing expedition for an employment tribunal claim, or simply to increase pressure on employers in order to try and secure a favourable outcome and a favourable exit package. We see that all of the time at the moment. It's particularly prevalent. But DSARs are not, DSARs are purpose blind. And what I mean by that is that generally a motive is irrelevant, which is all the more frustrating because you know why the individuals are making the request in some cases, but motive is irrelevant, which is hard for employers. And also in the current economic climate with, economic downturn, with increasing redundancies and effective employees feeling that they have little to lose in bringing a DSAR, our view and the reason for us putting on really today's webinar is we're seeing a real increase in them that we're advising on, and we think that that's set to continue. Now, data subjects have the right to access what we call personal data. So in simple terms, that's any information relating to the employee. So in an employment context, this means basically that DSARs can cover not just your typical HR data, so your stuff on the personnel file, any of your HR systems or payroll platforms, but also unstructured data. So things contained in emails, disciplinary, grievance meeting minutes, appraisal forms, And when you consider, for instance, emails and how many emails a typical employee may send and receive even a year, this puts a vast amount of data potentially within scope. We were asked a really good question actually by one of the delegates prior to today's session that I wanted to cover, and this was whether actually any data stored on, say, a manager's personal mobile would be covered. And my view on that is that it would be outside of the scope, because that's not something within the data controller's possession and control. And ultimately, if you go back to what I said a moment ago in terms of what the right of access is, the right of access is for the data subject to know what the data controller, the employer, is processing about the employee, and then to be given a copy of that. So I hope that answers the question that was raised in that regard. Just a few more points on this slide before we move on. So some DSARs will be focused on very specific topics to elicit information, for instance, whilst a disciplinary or redundancy or something like that is ongoing. And that's fine. Often they are a bit easier to deal with because they're more confined in nature. However, what we see in an employment context are very wide requests for all personal data held on the systems and files regarding me, along with all emails, blah, blah, blah. And actually, they are really tricky to deal with. And Michael's going to cover later today a little bit around seeking clarification and attempting to narrow that ambit. Now, personal data only includes information regarding natural persons. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean not corporate entities, for instance. And they, are natural persons who are identified or identifiable directly from the information in question, or they're identifiable from the information when combined with something else. So another question that's just popped in was in relation to if somebody is referred to by their initials, then would this count as personal data? And potentially, I think they would, because actually what you're saying is they are identifiable by their initials. So yes, I think that would fall within the ambit. So hopefully that helps that question that's come in. In terms of identifiers, in an employment context, what we often see is name, ID number, location data, information about performance at work, there's potentially dangerous one, opinions about the employee expressed by colleagues in email. I mean, that's the one where it can get employees into trouble. Also may include, IMs, WhatsApp messages. I've seen a number of those being requested. Sickness records, CCTV footage. These are the sorts of things that come across our desk when we are sifting employment-related DSAR data. Okay, thanks, Claire. Okay, just briefly touching on my last slide, which is all to do with recognising requests then. The data protection legislation does not require a subject access request to be in writing or in any set form. And in fact, it goes further than that, and it doesn't even need to say the word subject access or data protection. Okay. So I appreciate it can be tricky for managers who aren't well versed in these subjects to really spot these sometimes. They can even be verbal. So an employee can say something to a manager and that can count. So this really is a training issue, in my view, making people aware of this fundamental right of employees in the workforce so that they know to see the triggers where requests are made. So the ICO has suggested that requests might be made through social media as well. I mean, that could be vast. So that's something to bear in mind. Equally, text messages, WhatsApp messages. I've seen people make subject access requests through those means of communication as well. So do bear all of that in mind. Now, you're not allowed not supposed to make it compulsory for a subject access request to be provided in a certain format, for instance, on a form or something like that. But in practice, a lot of organisations encourage, and I say it's like that, encourage staff to obviously submit a request on a particular form that they may attach to the DSAR policy, for instance. Now, what's important to take from that, however, is that if somebody doesn't abide by your internal rules for putting, the information on a form or filling in every question on that form, that doesn't mean you don't have to deal with the request. So please do bear that in mind and make sure your managers are aware of that. So, as I say, training is key in relation to this. And as I mentioned a moment ago, requests can be framed in a very wide manner, particularly in an employment context. And Michael will cover a bit more on how to handle that and narrow them in a moment. Last point on the slide is that we often see requests made by third parties, typically legal representatives. And in fact, we don't only act for employers, we also act for individuals in certain occasions, and we'll often use them as a tactic when we're acting for individuals. Okay, if we could just swap the slide over then, Claire. We're now going to break for a moment just to do the poll. And as I said to you at the start, the poll is really designed just to gather some information from the 600 or so delegates. So if I could ask you to simply answer the 3 questions, they're coming up now. I believe you're going to have about 30 seconds to answer them, and you just have to click the box on the right hand side. And what we're going to do is we're going to gather all the feedback, and we'll get back to you at the end of today's session.
Before we move on, Adele, we've had a few questions come in, if I could throw them in, just because they all relate to your section, I'm afraid.
Don't worry, that's fine.
So we've had quite a few, I think, around this point of what do we have to disclose. I think you've touched on the WhatsApp messages. So WhatsApp messages on a manager's work mobile, I think they would be disclosable, and we have seen that, haven't we? And there have been some quite interesting disclosures.
The difference here is the work mobile and the personal mobile. So this was the point I was making. So the question that I answered earlier was in relation to a direct question that came in about a personal mobile. Now, I think if that's absolutely unrelated to work, that's separate. But a work mobile, oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no difference to your work laptop. It's just simply another device, Antonia. So absolutely.
And then an interesting one in the context we're working in at the moment, something that perhaps has been asked on a Microsoft Teams call or meeting that has been typed out. Again, I think if you've typed it out and retained it.
Permanent form, and therefore that would be included. I agree, Antonia.
Yeah. And another interesting one, so this is where they're collecting diversity information, but perhaps in the organisation they only have one employee who identifies as BAME, and of course they become identifiable even if they're not named, don't they?
Yeah, so I think that falls into that second bracket. They're not identified in the data, but they're identifiable from the data, and then absolutely that could be included therefore.
Yeah.
And
somebody, sorry,
I was just going to add on this, the work mobile and personal mobile. I think we've seen the grayer issues where there's personal mobiles being used for work-related matters, and that's where work policies are actually really important, because it can make it really grey in terms of is it or is it not, and I think those need to be considered really carefully.
And perhaps the flip to that as well, a work mobile but using a personal email. And again, I think, if you can't presume to have the right of privacy on a work device.
Yeah.
Oh,
definitely.
absolutely not.
Yeah. There are lots of grey areas like that.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Which is why people make wide requests as well for as much information as they could possibly get.
Yeah. Just on a couple of the points that came in on the first 2 things you covered, Adele. do we have an indication of fines for standard breaches? Well, I think, I mean, as I say, we're very much talking within the employee context.
Yeah.
And in my experience, the ICO tends to usually raise concerns or give compliance advice rather than go straight in with breaches.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much the case. And I think that that's indicative of the cases that I popped on the slide. The top two were, for instance, DSAR cases where there were breaches. The second of the two cases, it was about £1,500 fine. I mean, massive difference. But in both cases, like you've just said, Antonia, they sought to send notices, so compliance notices, enforcement notices, and giving organisations the ability to rectify their wrongs. In fact, in those two cases, they didn't comply with the enforcement notices sent by the ICO, which was why then obviously a fine was levied against them.
And somebody just asked very quickly about, is the UK GDPR incorporated into the Data Protection Act, or is it separate? Well, I think they've always been separate. So we had the GDPR for European legislation that was implemented by the DPA into the UK. But of course, now we have the UK GDPR, but that's to replace the European one. So they are both separate, but they are very interrelated, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just a useful thing to probably bear in mind is, if you Google the UK GDPR, you can actually have access to a Keeling schedule, which basically is a track change version of the old GDPR against the new one. So you can actually see the bits that have been taken out to make it UK specific. I mean, that helps to sort of bring it home.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. I'll let you crack on for a bit more.
Okay, thank you. So I think that brings the poll questions to an end. And as I say, we'll gather the data together from those and share it at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Michael. Thanks, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Adele. So once you've recognised that you've received a subject access request, as data controller, you have a duty to respond appropriately. Importantly, and in line with your obligations under GDPR, you will need to deal with the request lawfully, fairly, and transparently, which generally means that regardless of an employee's motivation, you should approach compliance in a positive and helpful way. Obviously, as lawyers, we'll skirt around those issues as best as we possibly can. But when responding, and this is something that Gwynneth will come on to later, you'll need to provide necessary information in a concise, transparent, intelligible, and easily accessible format, but more on that a little bit later, and some initial considerations first. So as we've already heard, it must be remembered that individuals are only entitled to access their own personal data, not that of other people's, unless, of course, that they are a third party. So like Adele said, we often make data subject access requests on behalf of employee clients when we act for them in very tactical manners. But it's important to ascertain who is making the request, or for whom if necessary, and whether you are satisfied as to the identity of the person making the request. The ICO's guidance in this area is that where a request comes from an employee, it will generally be obvious to you who is making the request, so you shouldn't need to ask for any kind of identification. But if there are reasonable doubts as to the identity of the individual on whose behalf a request is being sought, there is a legitimate right to ask for additional information such as appropriate ID or a signed letter of authority. So often we will provide a signed letter of authority when we are making requests on behalf of others. And all of requests for additional information must be reasonable, proportionate, and necessary. And this is all familiar terminology that we're used to as a result of GDPR. But once your identity has been confirmed, it is sensible to make an initial assessment of what is being sought by the request. Do you actually process data concerning the employee? Are you actually going to respond? Noting, of course, that there are only very exceptional circumstances where it's possible to refuse to respond. What's the scope of the request? Is it wide-ranging? Is it one of those really kind of awful requests that are made I would like to see all data processed about me throughout my entire employment? Or is it a shortened data subject access request, something more helpful to you? Do you need to seek clarification or additional information to enable you to carry out your searches or locate the data? Who's going to deal with it? Do you have internal policies and procedures that you need to follow? And how do you plan to go about retrieving the information? Does it just require a search of hard copy personnel records, or is it one of these searches of your entire kind of IS systems, which are going to be time consuming and costly? How long is it actually going to take you to find and retrieve the information? Who needs to be involved? Is it likely that other person's data will also feature? So is there going to be a large exercise of redaction afterwards? So like Adele said, we can already see that responding to a data subject access request can be time consuming because they are often very detailed exercises, and a lot of the motivation sometimes is to make them detailed exercises to push people into kind of a resolution situation, whether that's kind of settlement or otherwise. But what is often really useful in these exercises is to have a standard acknowledgement letter, because obviously there's a lot of considerations from the outset, but the use of that acknowledgement letter can be used to confirm to the data subject that their request has been received and that it will be dealt with appropriately. It's also useful evidence should you ever be called into question by the ICO later down the line. But that acknowledgement letter can really set out how and when the data subject will receive their response. It can deal with matters regarding clarification or time extensions or fees payable, things that I'll come on to shortly. But it also can be used to confirm what kind of initial searches will be used, and also refer to your data privacy statements or notices, whatever you call them, as necessary, which may actually satisfy some of the requirements of the request that has been made to you. But timing is of course key. All data subject access requests must be handled without undue delay and within 1 month. So in this respect, the time limit starts to run from either the date of receipt of the request or receipt of any information requested to confirm the employee's identity, or where a fee is payable, where you're entitled to charge one. And the ICO has provided some guidance. It's their new access guidance, which I'll refer to more later, but it makes special provision for cases in which the employer who processes a large amount of information about an employee needs to ask the employee to clarify the information or processing activities their request relates to before responding. And in such cases, the time limit for responding can be paused until the employer receives the information to clarify the request, but a little bit more on that later. But typically, when counting and noting the time frame of your response, you should calculate it from the day you receive the request until the corresponding calendar date in the next month. So if you therefore receive a request on the 3rd of January, you would have until the 3rd of February to respond. But do note that if the corresponding date falls on a weekend or a public holiday, you'll have until the next working day to respond. So sometimes there is just a slight extension. But it's also possible in some cases to extend that 1 month period by a further 2 months if the request is complex or there are numerous requests from the data subject. And whether the request is complex depends upon the specific circumstances of the particular request made. So what's the content? What is being asked? What may be deemed complex for one employer may not be for another, and that's largely to do with the size and the resource available to the employer. But the ICO's new access guidance gives various examples of factors that may, in some circumstances, add to the complexity of the request. And these include like technical difficulties in retrieving the information, for instance, where the data has been electronically archived, or in some cases where you may need to obtain specialist legal advice in response to the request that is being asked of you. The fact that a request involves a large volume of information, which is obviously very much, well, it's very often the case, that may add to the complexity of the request, but it will not be complex solely because the employee has requested a large amount of data. As we know today, data is huge, data in an organisation, and throughout an employee's employment life cycle, there's just so much of it. We've already heard the examples that Adele's provided. But the ICO's guidance also provides that if there are a number of requests from the data subjects on top of his or her data subject access request, such as a request for erasure or a request for portability of their data at the same time as the data subject access request is made, then this may mean that there is a legitimate and lawful reason for the time period to be extended. So these initial considerations are always there when receiving your request. Is the 1 month time frame going to be used only, or is there necessity to extend the time period by up to 2 months? Just moving over to the next slide then. As I mentioned before, there are only very exceptional circumstances where it is possible to refuse to respond to a request. And those limited circumstances are where the request is manifestly unfounded or manifestly excessive. That terminology is also applicable in the event that it may be possible for the employer to charge a reasonable fee in response to a request being made. But the burden of proof rests with the employer to determine whether the request is indeed manifestly unfounded or excessive. Therefore, if you do decide to go down this route in seeking to refuse to respond, you must be able to give your solid reasons, your solid justification, and also be in a position to tell the employee of your reasons for refusing to respond. But in doing so, the GDPR also requires you to set out that if they disagree with your reasoning, they can also complain to the ICO. And again, the ICO's new access guidance specifically states that employers must take the following into account when making their determination about whether a subject access request is manifestly unfounded. And ultimately, what they say is that each request must be considered individually. You should not presume that request is manifestly unfounded or indeed excessive just because the employee has previously submitted a request. And what they say about the inclusion of this word manifestly means that there must be an obvious or clear quality to the unfoundedness or indeed excessiveness. You have to have that strong justification, like I've mentioned, and as we all know, an employee's motivation is not always relevant. It may be relevant, but it won't be a sole determination. And the ICO goes on to say that if a request is malicious in intent and is being used to harass the employer with no real purpose other than to cause disruption, then there may be more reason to determine that the request is manifestly unfounded. So again, all of these initial considerations, and each case has to be decided upon its own facts. But when determining whether something is manifestly excessive, again, all circumstances need to be taken into account, including the nature of the requested information, the context of the request and the relationship between the employer and the employee's available resource, and whether the request largely repeats a previous request and a reasonable interval has not yet lapsed, or whether the request overlaps with other requests that are being made. So therefore, there really are limited circumstances where you will be able to choose not to respond. And like we've talked about, when you are responding, you have this obligation to undertake proportionate and reasonable searches in any event. So the better approach, if there are slight reservations about how much you may want to respond, obviously go through what you consider to be your proportionate and reasonable searches and respond, send over the information as necessary, and then you can always wait for arguments to follow that, arguments that may follow to the extent that you may not have done those proportionate and reasonable searches, but at least you've done something, and then you can justify your position thereafter to the ICO if necessary. And again, it's going to be before any kind of penalties are imposed. You'll have the ability to justify your position. So moving on then, so I've mentioned a lot about the ICO's new guidance, and fortunately the ICO has, after 2.5 years since GDPR actually came into force, updated their guidance when dealing with data subject access requests, and that came through in October last year. The three main areas are set out on the slides there. Obviously, I've just covered what manifestly excessive is about, so I'll focus on 1 and 2 now. So stopping the clock for clarification. I touched upon this briefly, and as I mentioned, where you process a large amount of information about an employee, you can ask them for more detail about what information they are after and where it is likely to be held. You can ask about the context in which they believe you may have been processing their data. What are the dates that they believe their data has been processed between? The aim of your request for clarification should not, however, be to narrow the scope of their request, and that's become clearer since the ICO guidance. But if you do ask the right questions, that narrowing of a request may just happen quite naturally rather than intentionally, as you may have previously gone about doing. But the ICO's new guidance does confirm that where clarification is properly sought, the time limit for responding to a request is paused, the clock is stopped until you receive that clarification. And the guidance also gives an example. So just looking at the example that they've provided, it says that if the employer receives a request on the 14th of May, the time limit starts from that same day, which we accept. The employer has 1 month to reply in the usual course, so it should respond by the 14th of June. Okay so far. So however, if the employer asks for clarification on the 15th of May, the clock stops from that date until the date on which the employee responds. So if the employee provides clarification on the 18th of May, the time limit resumes on that date. So the clock was therefore stopped between the 15th and the 18th of May, and that's actually your 3-day stop. So your original deadline would be extended by that 3-month period. And again, I've mentioned acknowledgement letters at the outset. If you are going to ask for your clarification, that's where you want to ask for your clarification as soon as possible. So ultimately, you can set out what your additional questions are, and you can also explain what the consequences are of seeking that additional clarification and the effect of stopping the clock until they respond to your request for clarification. Turning to number 3, this was always a bit unknown, but again, the updated guidance confirms that fees can be charged, and it's a reasonable fee, but fees can only be charged for manifestly unfounded or excessive requests. So, and if there is a manifestly unfounded or repeated request, ultimately you can take into account administrative costs of responding to that request, and those administrative costs may include your typical photocopying, printing, postage and other costs involved in transferring or otherwise providing the information, but it also could go a little bit further in terms of equipment and supplies, folders, disks, USB devices, etc. But on top of that, staff time could also be built into the equation, providing it is a manifestly excessive or unfounded request. And if you are going to charge staff time, it must be on a reasonable hourly rate, and it must set out the anticipated time that it will take to complete. But if a fee is charged in these limited circumstances, you will not have to respond until you've actually received that fee back. But again, it's a limited circumstance in which you can charge a reasonable fee. Okay, moving on. So going about finding the personal data. So I've covered obviously those first 3 points in terms of seeking clarification, but yeah, it's go about finding the personal data. What are you actually looking for? But so it's important to remember your overall duty here, that is to find the relevant personal data, but to do so by undertaking your proportionate and reasonable searches of your systems in response to the data subject access request made. And how that is done really depends upon the nature of the request, how personal data is stored within your organization, and your general approach to information management. But typically, as we know and as we've heard already, most data will be held on your main servers. So much of it is obviously going to be contained in your emails. So emails are a good starting point, as well as any other structured personnel files, whether hard copy or online. But typically, when searching for personal data, you would look at a number of individuals' email accounts. It's often the case that the subject request details which email accounts should be looked at. So look at those, use search tools within those email accounts to identify any emails that refer to the data subject, search by their name, their initials, or other determined identifiers. But there may, of course, be other places to look, including backed up data, so archive data, deleted data may be requested, but if that data has already been deleted, you are not required to reinstate it, or other data held on other systems or held by other processes, because, for instance, you may outsource your payroll, so your payroll provider will be processing data elsewhere. But overall, unfortunately, you cannot get away with the fact that you'll need to make an extensive effort to find and retrieve the requested information. It's often a group exercise, like Adele said, but your efforts must remain reasonable and proportionate. So always do consider that kind of threshold and don't necessarily go beyond it. But just finally from me, please do remember, so my final slide just talks about remembering that the data subject access request relates to data processed by you as data controller as at the time the request is received. And most of that data will never change. It's a snapshot of the data that's being processed at the time the data subject access request is received. Some of the data may, however, change whilst you're dealing with the request. It may be amended, such as address or contact details, or it may even be deleted because of your retention policies, and therefore it's deemed reasonable to supply only the information that you hold in its then present form when you make your response. But by word of warning, do not delete any data so as to defeat the purpose of the subject access request. It's actually a criminal offence for you or anyone employed in your organisation to alter or erase information with the intention of preventing disclosure. So you have been warned, but yeah, an extensive activity is required for finding all of this personal data anyway. And I'll pass over to Gwynneth.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so you've all now found your data, you've looked at changes to data, and now we are ready to send our information off to the individual, or are we? So I think there can be a temptation sometimes that if you find the files for your individual who's made the data subject access request, you just send it off without checking them. And just want to add, just be really, really careful that you don't send files off without, or information off without checking them, because inevitably you will come across documents within that file or within the information which contain personal data about other people as well as that individual making the DSAR. And the question that we get often asked is, what do we do with this third-party data? Do we disclose it, or can we just take it all out? Now, the ICO guidance on third-party information is that where possible, you need to consider if it's possible to comply with the SAR requests without disclosing information that identifies another person other than the subject, the data subject. If it's not possible, you will only need to disclose that information if that third party has agreed to disclosure, or you as an employer have assessed that it's reasonable to comply with the request without that individual's consent. So basically, it's a three-step approach, and we've divided it up in the slide here. First question to ask is, does the request require disclosure of information that identifies another individual? And then once you've answered that, has the other individual consented? And if not, would it be reasonable to disclose without consent? So in the first question of does the request require disclosure of a third party's information? I think it's easy to see that names, of course, identifies another individual, but it's not necessary that without a name, the information which is presented to you doesn't identify somebody else. It may be that there's a reference to a line manager. It may be that there's a reference to various job titles. Those job titles will identify a third party. And it may not be a name, but a comment like, for example, B's work is poor, she's always late. And if that particular manager is only referred to by their job title, then actually they are likely to be identifiable. So just be careful of that. You can delete names or edit documents to remove third-party information, and that's going to be the easiest way of removing third-party data. The other question to ask is, has the other individual consented? Now, if the other individual has consented, then you must disclose that information to the person asking for the or making the data subject access request. However, you're not obliged to seek consent, and it may actually be impracticable or inappropriate to do so. So if you don't want others to know about the DSAR, for example, or often people have left employment, so you can't actually get hold of them to obtain their consent. You're then in the position of having to redact the information or considering whether it's reasonable to disclose without consent. Now, the types, in order to consider whether or not it's reasonable to disclose without consent, think about the type of information that you're disclosing. If you have loads of business as usual emails, which are about mundane things, then actually it may be that there's no problem in disclosing that data because there's no impact on privacy rights of other individuals if you disclose that data. But we just advise using caution if you're disclosing any information about a third party without their consent, unless that data has that minimal impact on their freedom, their privacy rights and their freedoms. And I've mentioned redaction. This is a term we often use because we deal with so many data subject access requests. But basically, redaction is a process of separating disclosable from non-disclosable information by blocking out. You can block out individual words, sentences, paragraphs, or even swathes of pages before you release that information to your individual. That's redaction. And then note that actually, if you have a third party who does have line management responsibility for the person making the access request, then it's likely that it's going to be reasonable to disclose that information if it relates to performance of that individual's role or of that individual in that role. We had a few questions come up in terms of disclosure, a question about, do we disclose, can we hold back private internal emails, opinions made by others about this individual? Now, I know there's been a whole load of discussion about whether opinions count or don't count towards a third party's personal data. But in effect, if an opinion identifies that individual and it relates to that individual, so I say, oh, I think Michael's really good looking. That relates to Michael, and that's my opinion, but it clearly identifies Michael, and it clearly relates to him, and that opinion is disclosable to Michael if he makes a data subject access request. So yes, it is personal data which will need to be disclosed, but often those kinds of statements and comments can be quite grey, and if you're unsure, then seek advice. Similarly, we had a question about grievances. Now, the part that there may be circumstances where people who have made the grievance don't want the grievance to be disclosed to the individual. Now, there will be parts of the grievance, so it's not necessary to release the whole grievance, but there will be parts of the grievance which relate to the individual, which must be disclosed because it relates to them. And also, in order for them to, answer allegations against them, and there may be, on a case-by-case basis, a need to disclose identity of the complainant. And again, that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, and balancing of rights, privacy rights, and rights of access. Because obviously you will owe a duty of confidentiality to the person making the complaint if they don't want that disclosure to be made. But again, the individual will have a right to know the case against them. So those things will need to be carefully considered. I'd say at this point in time, there's often I think, misconception that HR exchanges or internal reference or internal statements or comments or email exchanges which are marked confidential will not need to be disclosed. I'm afraid to tell you that those are absolutely disclosable. So, just because there's an HR opinion and commentary about performance and what they need to be, what the line manager needs to be doing in terms of approaching the individual, that, because it's come from HR, it's not confidential. And just by marking a document or piece of information as confidential doesn't attract any sort of exemption. So I'll look at exemptions next, which will give us some clarity on what type of information you as an organization may want to rely on for not complying with a SAR request. Now, we've listed a whole load of different exemptions which you can rely on for not complying, but the highlighted ones are the ones most relevant, and I'll look at those in a little bit more detail. So basically, confidential references which are given or received in confidence and about an individual's employment or prospective employment, that is exempted from a SAR request. So you don't need to disclose them. But be mindful that it is only those references which are made in confidence which are exempt. So if you are giving a reference, make sure that you mark the reference confidential, otherwise you may lose that exemption. Management information. Now, this is business information forecasting or management planning, and that's exempt from the right of access if, to comply with a SAR request, it be likely to prejudice your business forecasting or your business planning. So I suppose a typical example would be in a redundancy exercise. Now, if you are planning a redundancy exercise and an employee gets whiff of that exercise to be run at some point in the future, and they know that there are management discussions going on, so they may make a subject access request ahead of employees being told about the plans. And if they do that, then you can rely on this exemption and not disclose that information. Now, this doesn't mean that once the redundancy exercise has been completed, that you can rely on that exemption. But I mean, I would say that if you are looking at management planning and management forecasting, most of that business information will not be related to that individual employee and will not contain their personal information, and will not be caught by the SAR or the SAR anyway. But that's another exemption. Now, negotiations with the requester, that's obviously a very important one for lots of you, because here what it means is that negotiations with the person making the SAR, and typically these negotiations will be in settlement discussions. Now, these do not have to be disclosed and your internal discussions about your approach to that individual, or your thought process about how you go about settling or what levels of settlement you're going to be offering to them, that those discussions are exempted as well. And then finally, legal advice and proceedings, which of course we as legal advisors rely on a lot. Now, advice from your company's lawyers about an individual's case, whether that's in a disciplinary or grievance or a redundancy, or when litigation is being contemplated or being considered or actually in process, that's all exempted and you don't need to disclose that. So we've weeded out all our exemptions. We've redacted third-party data. Now we're in a position to formally respond to the subject access requests. As Michael said earlier, the response, the ICO says that the response has to be accessible, it's got to be concise, it's got to be intelligible in an intelligible format. So basically, they need to be able to access it easily, and it needs to be straightforward and easy for them to read. You will need to respond to the SAR in the same way as the request was made, unless the requester asks otherwise. So if the request basically is made by email, electronically, then you respond by email or by another common electric format. If the request is made by letter or verbally, you can still respond using a common electronic format, e.g. by sending the information by email. But if you do send by email, make sure that you are, or whatever way you choose to send it, make sure that that disclosure of information is sent securely. So you've added passwords, you've added encryptions before releasing that information to the individual. Now, where we deal with SARs on behalf of clients, what we do is we create portals and we invite the individual to access that portal for their information. And there's no reason, I'm sure some of you are already doing that, and that's quite a nice and easy, secure way of allowing access of an individual to their information, but also it's a really good way of keeping that information all together. And it's a good audit trail as well if ever challenged. I've set out here, what you need to be sending or providing as part of your information disclosure to the individual. So you've obviously got to send them a copy of their personal data, any of their personal data. There isn't a requirement to provide a specific document, but mostly you would find you're either providing whole documents or you're providing documents with redactions in them, or you can also, if you've got a few documents where actually there very few references to the individual, so you may have a firm-wide document or company-wide document which perhaps mentions the individual once, then instead of just redacting the document or those documents, you can extract them into a separate spreadsheet or a separate document to just minimize the volume of documents you're going to be sending across. Extract that personal data, and that will be enough in terms of disclosure. If personal data is repeated, you only need to provide it once. So if you've got a chain of emails, you need only provide, so you've got the starting email followed by a response, for example. You only need to provide one full email which shows the whole chain. You don't need to provide multiple copies of that personal data. And then I've just set out the all the additional information which the UK GDPR now says that you've got to provide at the same time as providing the the copy of the personal information. And basically it's just setting out the reasons for processing, who you've shared the personal data with, how you've done your search, how long you're keeping their data for. A lot of that information you probably can get from your employee or your workforce privacy notice, but that list is obligatory in terms of response to the individual. Challenges, I'm now going to canter through this really quickly because I'm conscious of time. Challenges to DSAR response, just so you're aware, an individual may challenge the response if they don't think you've complied with SR request properly. They can complain to the ICO, apply to the court for compliance order or civil claim for damages. Now, Adele's already mentioned some stats, but what we've seen is from an employee who's unhappy is most likely to complain to the ICO because it's free. To take any other route would probably be disproportionate and too expensive in most circumstances. And interestingly enough, the ICO has shown that there are only a handful of SAR complaints about HR-related SARs made between May 2018 and March 2019. There are only about 19 HR-related cases. I don't know whether their stats are out of date. Out of the reported 41.5 DSAR complaints, only 20 related HR cases. I'm not quite sure about that, but that's quite good reading. And out of if it's any reassurance, out of all those reported to the ICO, actions taken by the ICO were either no actions taken, compliance advice given to the employer, or concerns raised with the employers, but certainly no sanctions at the moment. So the first responses of the ICO will be likely at this point to educate and to advise. I've set out their practical tips, but I mean, to be honest, we've dealt with most of them already. It goes without saying that you've got to reduce the data you hold. You've got to. We see very robust policies on retention and deletion, but often we don't see people complying with them. They sit there as very nice policies, and then people then forget about them and actually takes no notice of them, so that when a SAR is made, we're holding a load of old historic information, which do we have a reason to hold them at this point in time, 20 years later? So, just be mindful that if you do have policies, and you need to have policies, make sure that you comply with them, and make sure you've got a DSAR policy in place so that people know where to go to. There's a consistent process to deal with your SARs. You've got standard request forms and standard templates for responding. So again, there's a consistency in dealing with these SARs. I've talked about data room for facilitating reviews. Keep a record of your details of any requests you receive, and importantly, train your staff to identify, to understand what a SAR request might look like, and to be able to pass it on to the relevant, the proper core party or core person within your organization who will know how to deal with the request. In the second slide, practical tips, as Adele said right at the beginning, often HR-related SARs or employee-related SARs are because they're unhappy, and they tend to be conjoined with a tribunal matter. Now, many employees are now putting in SARs as a way of leveraging settlement. So if settlement is on the cards, and make sure that you settle, your settlement agreement includes a withdrawal of that SAR, because what you don't want is for that SAR to continue after that settlement agreement has been reached. I've got some slides on data breach. I'm going to actually, due to time constraints, and actually because our data breach slides are fairly comprehensive in terms of high level, and often I think, from an HR perspective, somebody else tends to have to deal with a breach. I think your takeaway is that if there is a data breach, which is likely to result in an impact, a detrimental impact on the privacy rights of individuals, then this has got to be reported to the ICO within 72 hours. And perhaps, where the risk is high in terms of privacy breach, privacy impact, then you've also got to report it to the data subject without undue delay. So the takeaway from that is that your workforce, your employees, need to be able to identify where there is going to be, they need to know if something comes in, or if they've done something wrong, they've sent an email to the wrong person, or they've left their laptop on a bus or on a train, probably not in COVID times, but certainly afterwards. then that's going to be a data breach. And do we need to inform? They can't sit on that breach or that potential breach. They need to action it straight away. And I think that's a takeaway. And I will pass back to Antonia for questions. I don't even know if we've got time.
Well, I was going to say we've had an influx of questions throughout the session, some of which I think we've been able to answer as we've gone along, some we haven't. What I think we'll do, given time, is probably take some of those and do a question and answer document that we can send out to delegates, because there are a lot of common themes coming through. I suppose there were maybe just sort of 2 or 3 points we could quickly, I think, pick up. One of them, it's interesting what you were saying about retention, Gwynneth, because a lot of people were sort of saying, well, how do retention periods impact on our ability to disclose? What if we haven't got the data? And obviously, if you're not holding that data, then there is nothing to disclose. So actually, you're right, Gwynneth, aren't you? The more you can use your retention policies to destroy data, actually that helps you because it will cut down what you have to disclose. If you haven't got it, there's nothing there, isn't it? So
yeah, and the ICO are really clear that they're not going to make you, go back all that time and retrieve data which has already been permanently deleted.
Yeah. And another interesting question, I think, do you need to have a valid reason for a DSAR? Well, no, it's a fundamental right that data subjects have, and that's why I think they're often used in such a tactical way. Certainly in my experience, would that be borne out by what you see?
Completely right.
Yeah.
Completely agree. It's often a tactical measure.
Yeah.
Especially in
Or during
employment, I
litigation.
think. Yeah.
Alongside grievances, pre-litigation or during litigation.
However, there is now an ability to push back. So we know that someone is raising subject access requests purely for the purposes of settlement, and they say, well, actually, if you deal with, I will actually, here's my subject access request, but if you pay me £5,000, I'll withdraw it. Then you don't actually have to comply with the SAR. So that's an interesting development.
Okay. And a lot of the other questions are around kind of more detail around what do we need to search for. So I think if we cover those in a Q&A, that's probably going to be most useful. And then people have got it as a takeaway. Great. Okay.
I think we'll also wrap up the poll results in the takeaway document as well, Antonia, because I think that would be useful for people to have a copy of. So we'll send that out as well.
Lovely.
Thanks everyone for attending today. We hope you found the session really useful and we look forward to seeing you on future sessions. Thank you.